Over the past couple of months, we have looked at a variety of Bible texts that talk directly about the danger of being misled and the kinds of deceptions that believers must be prepared to face in the days and months ahead. We laid down the foundation on spiritual warfare in the first 3 weeks. It was brief, but it was there. And those opening Sundays, we studied the sources of deception and the capacities and characteristics of fallen spirits who promote and spread lies and destructive ideologies. And since that opening, we have touched on, for a couple of weeks each, science and history. And today I want to focus beginning with the political sphere of life. Now, you might have noticed that to engage in any one of these categories, we are continually traveling through history, and these topics continue to crisscross. That will be the case from this point forward. So let me remind you of the one text that was our center point back in December. The Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. Now, a month ago, before the holidays kicked into high gear, we looked at how such doctrines became the foundations for both the First and Second World Wars. And even before the 20th century began, those ideologies of the European leaders were well established. We identified them as what we call social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is a theory that cultural advancement is the product of intergroup conflict and competition, and the socially elite classes, such as those possessing wealth and power, possess biological superiority in the struggle for existence. And where Charles Darwin focused on the development of biological creatures and Karl Marx focused on economic issues, social Darwinism becomes a hybrid where nature, economics, and cultures battle it out in the survival of the fittest, and the best ends up on top. Yet even this term, social Darwinism, has become an example of what I want to explain to you today. When I looked this term up, the opening statement said that this theory has been largely discredited. And the Encyclopedia Britannica used the word declined. Now, to concede, it is true that society did not evolve naturally as the originators of this theory believed it should. We'll get back to that failure later. But because of this, I do admit that we are no longer technically using this term as it began. Yet I do strongly disagree that the root of this theory has gone away. This term still serves as a description of society being altered. The question really is it natural or is it by means of manipulation? You see, in business and finance, there are those who use this concept to determine that they are the most fit to survive. So they destroy all competition and become a near monopoly. In social structures, there are those who engineer laws and rules to require large segments of the population to comply with the change they want to see take place. Social Darwinism, as it has now morphed, does not describe a democratic process where average people elect representatives, cast their votes, and the majority becomes law. Instead, it describes what happens when significant changes take place through those who are convinced that they know better what is best for everyone else. And they know how far the cultural evolution should have moved us by now. Just by review, this group is also known as elitists. You see, who gets to decide which people, nation, group, or entity deserves to survive or be superior? The elitists. Only the elite, the specially trained, the smarter, the more educated, the more connected, the more enlightened should make the decisions for the masses. You see, in their thinking, someone or a few must decide what social structures, laws, and ideas are most evolved and therefore best for everyone. In fact, every time a decision is made which comes from a few in a segment of society, which then impacts the larger remainder of society, we should be suspicious that such a decision may actually be one more example of a morphed social Darwinism being applied, perhaps using different terminology. So consider example, the situation with redefining marriage almost 3 years ago. 31 states had taken votes from their own people who clearly had the majority to pass state-level amendments protecting traditional marriage. One man, one woman. So they did. And yet in one day, 50 million American votes in support of the ancient and formerly accepted definition of marriage became completely irrelevant. When on June 26th, 2015, only 5 unelected Supreme Court justices ignored the will of the people and redefined marriage for everybody, and against the desire of the other 4 justices. My point is this: when you have an ideology or a philosophy or a doctrine or a worldview that you insist must be embraced by everybody else, then the ends do justify the means. In this case, just change the terms. In other words, don't tell anybody what you really mean. As Americans, we're supposed to accept the new definition for what was clearly understood. Now marriage doesn't mean marriage anymore. And the same is true for 25 other nations. In December, Australia became the 26th nation to redefine marriage. Only 169 more to go. However, the truth is that the words carry meaning. You see, our entire faith as believers in the New and Old Testament is built on the concept and conviction that words carry weight. When our God says that He loves us to the point that He sent His Son as our only solution for sin, He meant it. When God says that deceivers and promoters of demonic doctrines are motivated by things such as power, recognition, passions, wealth, or even worship, He means it. When God says that many will come to mislead people away from both Himself as Creator and from the truth wherever it will be found, He means it. The terminology to describe specific things in life are for our understanding, and they're critical for actual communication between one another. I mean, if we're using the same word in a conversation, but with completely different meanings from the two parties, our communication is going to be confusing at best, and at worst, it's going to cause conflict and pain. So with all that in the background, we should expect, as believers who are trying to put things together through a biblical worldview, that our terms and our vocabulary and our definitions of words are weapons in the arsenal of deception. You see, when the enemy cannot get you to be drawn down a dark road by what is proposed or what is asked, then they will change the terms, change the definition of the terms, or do both. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. The prophet Isaiah was speaking to the nation of Israel as God's special vineyard. This is before the fall of the northern kingdom, 720-something BC. And instead of producing good grapes and a healthy harvest, the Israelites had turned away from God, not because of the unintended consequences of a busy life. We understand that part. But because of deliberate rejection of God's word. And in their arrogance, these Old Testament term changers were convinced that they knew better, as we find out in the next verse. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Every so often, you find an insight into God's word that just nails it. And I think that's the case with this commentary on verse 20. In Isaiah's day, moral standards were destroyed by new definitions of sin. People using God's vocabulary, but not His dictionary. Now, hold on to that image as we move forward today. While it is not God's dictionary that we're going to look at specifically, we are dealing with a deliberate attempt to redefine what is accurate, what is false, what really happened, what really did not, and the attempt to redefine what is good and what is bad. Now, who's behind this deliberate effort to rewrite and redefine all aspects of life and life's values? Let me recall the answer to that question and review it. We read it already earlier in the letter to Timothy, who gives us at least one category of people. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars, whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. Lies and even demonically inspired ideologies are spread from those who have embraced falsehood for so long that they no longer have a conscience to discern between truth and error. While the book of Romans offers us another group, those who are probably less responsible for what they're doing because they don't know that they're spreading dangerous or false information. Here's what Romans 16 says. By smooth talk and flattery, they, the leaders or teachers of lies, deceive the minds of naive people. I don't want you to be naive. That's why I'm doing this series. Of those involved in the rewriting of history or values or ethics or word definitions, we have those who are the evangelists for their cause. They're at the forefront since they tell us that they have a mission to fix what they think is wrong with our society. And they make it to the covers of magazines and Sunday morning talk shows, and they march in protests and show up at late-night comedy shows. They're easy to find and easy to identify. The second group, not so much. There are others that remain hidden and direct things through proxies, so we don't get to hear or see a lot of them directly. Instead, their money enables thousands of other people to do their bidding. Still others are unaware, and they are being used due to their ignorance, as Romans 16 already reminds us. Yet the areas of influence that are largely controlled by such voices include the places that most impact everyday existence, the places where we get our information, the news, like the New York Times, the entertainment industry, and the education system. It's not enough to say, well, I gave up on watching or reading news back in the 90s, so that's not going to affect me. Nor is it enough to say, I don't watch videos or read new books or go to the movies, so the entertainment industry will never pull something over my eyes. Maybe true. Maybe it's both true in your case. But you cannot escape the educational aspect. Let's say your last written assignment for school was turned in 60 years ago. But you have to ask yourself, what is the educational heritage of the judge that is deciding your case next week? The teacher for your kid or grandchild, where did that young woman get her certification to teach? Or the professor who you're paying to enlighten your college student? The administrator at the insurance company, where did that person develop his worldview or her worldview? And that person's the one who's going to make a decision about your insurance claim. Of course, among the sources of information such as the media, Hollywood, and academia, the political sphere is either leading or being led by these three cultural voices. I've been doing some more thread tracing. I guess that's what you might call the process of connecting the various points in the web of deception. And this time I've been looking at the history of our American political parties since the Civil War, which is really where they became solidified to what we understand them to be now. It was at that time that the modern Republican and Democratic parties were put together. And yet to do that research, I had to go to Europe first because of what was taking place there. So let me start by defining some critical terms which surround us all the time, right and left. The political use of these two terms dates back to 1789, just after we ratified our U.S. Constitution, and this was the year that the French Revolution began. In the National Assembly in Paris, which was their governing body, the partisans, or the revolutionaries, sat on the left in that organization, in that room, while the opponents, who were supportive of the monarchy, sat on the right in the auditorium. And we're going to look at more of this next week, but suffice it to say for the moment that right and left are among the top terms that have been redefined and even reversed in our lifetime for the purposes of deception. So now, when you listen to political evangelists, what is good and best for humanity, where does it come from? It only comes from the left, while what is self-centered and oppressive and even wicked comes from the right. Now, how did right become left and left become right? Here's where things get a little bit tricky. When it comes to comprehending the mindset or even the methodology of those who are in the elite categories, the only thing that I have found to be consistent is the inconsistency. Now, don't get me wrong, the objective to control and direct all aspects of life remains the constant objective, but arriving there appears to be all over the playing field. Let me give you an example. Do you recall what used to be a default setting in our cultural consciousness when it came to somebody accused of a crime in our nation? Now, if you've ever watched one of those episodes, it's been on for almost 30 years now, Cops, you know the tagline. All suspects are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Yet this recent barrage of sexual misconduct cases within political circles, within Hollywood, and among talk show hosts is evidence that this default setting is reversed. I don't know, so I'm not saying any or all of these men are innocent. But it does bother me that now a simple accusation is being considered equivalent with a court case being decided. So much so that the new understanding for so many of us, just knee-jerk reaction to any of the interviews on the street, you will see, we now, when you hear about somebody who supposedly did something to somebody, what's the verdict? Guilty until you've proven innocent. Even then, we know you still did it. Perhaps you've seen this in an even more disturbing way in actual sexual assault cases. Have you ever felt, as you listen to it, that it sounds as if the victim is actually the person that should be doubted concerning her testimony? Or even maybe she should be under investigation herself for what happened to her, while the perpetrator is somehow given the benefit of the doubt without thought. As rational thinkers, I assume that you are, I try to be, we start to feel as if we've entered the upside down or the twilight zone. But this reversal of what once made sense is a critical tool in the arena of creating more deception and undermining what is right and what is just. I've recently finished a book by Dinesh D'Souza called The Big Lie. I'd highly recommend it, and it serves as the basis for a lot of what I want to share today. It is quite eye-opening, and that's why I would recommend it to you. Yet I have to say it's also quite chilling. If even a part of the research that he's done is being played out in our culture today, we're really, really in dark times. I also want you to see a quote from his book, which sort of sets the tone for today's topic and tries to explain this weirdness that we're experiencing. Blaming the victim is a lie, but a lie of a special type. Normally, lying is a distortion of the truth. But when a perpetrator blames the victim, he does more than blame an innocent party. He blames the very party that is being directly harmed by his actions. Blaming the victim involves the perpetrator and victim exchanging places. The bad guy becomes the good guy, and the good guy becomes the bad guy. When you see this rejection of common sense and the reversal of what used to be normal, please do not think that you're alone in your perception or that you're losing your mind. You are not. You are witnessing a deliberate attempt to call right wrong and redefine wickedness as a blessing. So let's return to the failure of social Darwinism as it was originally conceived. Now, I hope to relay this history in a way that makes it a little bit more enjoyable for those of you who are not into dates and names. So you should expect to hear a little bit of sarcasm, which is not common for me. It was 1859 when Englishman Darwin published the first edition of his book. Here's the title: On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Even the full title, which you don't usually hear, tells you that Darwin was looking beyond plants and birds towards what would become eugenics, racism, Hitler's Germany, and ethnic genocide. While Karl Marx's work, the Communist Manifesto, had already been in print for a decade in Germany. Darwin served as the prophet of natural selection concerning biological creatures. The fit would survive and dominate the animal and plant world. While in Germany, Marx served as the prophet of economic freedom. In Marx's view, the evolution of society and finance would bring us to a time when those with little or nothing would eventually overtake those with everything and redistribute Earth's riches equally to everybody. Now, to make sure you understand what I'm about to present, let me clarify some terms. Capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods. Prices, production, and the distribution of goods are determined mainly by competition in a free market. So, for example, if I invent something or build something, then I can sell it if I want or I can keep it. It's mine. The one who made it owns it. The one who works earns an income for that work. If I try to sell my possession, I can ask any price for it, and the consumer ultimately will decide if that price is too high or if they think they're made a great deal and they're going to buy it. The next two words have often a different meaning, so keep that in mind. Remember, our terms are changing, some of them legitimately over time, and others by default, or not by default, but by manipulation. But these next two are closer to the ideal perspective of Karl Marx when he was thinking about them. And they're part of his core doctrine, what we would consider ideal definitions. First is socialism. Socialism is an economic form with the state owning and or controlling the distribution of goods and services. There is no private property in this system, and it's a transition between capitalism and communism. State control is considered the most efficient way to make proper societal transition and to make sure that everybody gets the same and nobody has more than anybody else. How's that going? But the theory goes like this. Once the world evolves through this period of transition called socialism, then we reach the goal of Karl Marx, communism. The final stage in Marxist theory in which the state has withered away and economic goods are distributed equally. Now, since this can be confusing, as it has been to me, maybe this progression chart will help you see how things are supposed to get together historically. Historically, we begin with feudalism. You remember the lords and ladies and the kings and just everybody else underneath, no middle class. To capitalism, where people kind of earn and keep their own stuff. To socialism, where the state determines who gets the stuff. To the place where we find heaven on earth, called communism. In the communist utopia, everyone in society will jointly own the means of production, and there's no need to have a state at all. Now, to be honest, I have not studied enough to find out how those goods and services will be distributed fairly without some external controlling factor. But I am guessing that it has to do with a belief in the goodness of man. You see, once this perfect environment has descended upon earth by the social engineers, then man's inner goodness will drive him to want to be generous to everybody and not keep more of his own stuff. Yeah, no. Are you beginning to see how this ideology is actually a religion with political clothing? Now remember, we've not reached communist utopia, neither historically nor in the minds of those who follow Marxist ideologies. So when you look up these words, you're going to find a more functional definition as well. So look down when you go to Webster's, go to number 2, 3, or 4, and you'll see them. Both communism and socialism are descriptions of state ownership or regulation of products and services. So while we really ought to be talking about socialism, most of the time when we talk about Karl Marx, we do in normal practice use these terms interchangeably, and you'll find myself doing the same thing. But one more term, which is self-evident, I also throw into the mix as an alternative, which we also use as synonyms with socialism or communism, and that is a Marxist, one who follows Karl Marx's ideology. You still with me? Now, unfortunately, there was a problem with the words and visions of both Charles and Karl concerning the future. You see, by the time of their famous books in the middle 1800s, the Industrial Revolution was well underway. While it certainly brought its own troubles, evils, and social problems, it also changed how people earned a living and offered better options for living conditions, healthcare issues, sanitation in hospitals, and access to goods and services like trains and ability to move from one place to the other quicker. And while there were riots and revolts in various places over the world because of working conditions, those oppressed workers, which Marx was counting on to spark this widespread revolt against the bourgeois upper class, never really happened. And by the way, such a revolution was only expected to take place in those nations that had trade, industry, and capitalism, which were steps along the way towards the communist utopia. But that's not how history unfolded. Instead, from the time of Marx's prediction in the 1850s to the earliest time of the 1900s, in Germany and England specifically, the average income had nearly doubled among the middle class. Many more workers were not doing so bad that they needed to revolt and occupy Wall Street and forcibly take their fair share. It never really materialized on any large scale. And yes, by the way, that American event is part of this process too. So as a result, the prophecies of Marx and Darwin had to be reevaluated by disciples of both men. The strange thing was, the first massive manifestation of Darwin or Marx's vision for the future occurred where it was never expected, in Russia of all places. You see, at the start of the 20th century, Russia was not considered developed as a nation, nor were they considered significantly capitalistic. In fact, they're kind of old school. They had a czar, a monarch with a king-type leadership system, and a government group with various lords and ladies and underlings and serfs at the bottom. So it looked a lot more like the feudal system of the Middle Ages. So when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, right in the middle of World War I, it actually bypassed capitalism. So it really messed up the prophetic timeline. Beyond that, the Russian Revolution was not initiated by the working class, rebelling against the rich and oppressive overlords. Instead, it was organized as a military revolution against the Tsar. Yes, it did gather the masses of regular, starving, hungry, upset people. But the revolutionary leaders were not poor farmers. They were lawyers, journalists, and the learned among the elite of their day. So in the desire to achieve social, economic, and political perfection through Marxist-Darwinism, something had to change. That is my term. I made it up. You won't find it in a dictionary. Yeah, I can make up terms too. Now, the intellectually honest Marxist admitted at the time that, you know what, communism, as it was originally proposed, was not likely to occur naturally. And after 50 or more years of progress, it really wasn't needed anymore the same way it was in Marx's mind. Those in the working class were not all starving. The result was a split in Marxist ideology. Those who saw potential in what Marx originally envisioned determined to hold on to their faith. They would wait for the political and social conditions to be just right, and then the words of their Savior would come true in natural social evolution. Now, I'm not sure if there are many of these people left today. They were not fit to survive. On the other side, those more zealous to see changes had a different perspective. And on that side, Marx and Darwin and our disciples redefined the words of their prophets. And they came up with newer and more detailed versions of socialism that better fit their vision. So you end up with a family tree, if you trace it, where the root remains the same. You call it socialism or Marxism or Marxist-Darwinism, but each branch has their own version and better idea of how to achieve the ideal original vision of their master, where those most fit to lead get to lead. And initially the split was between two philosophies that you have heard of, and they came to dominate the 20th century. On the one side, we have Bolshevism, or Leninism, as it's now called. On the other side, we have National Socialism, or fascism. Now, Vladimir Lenin was a key player in the Russian Revolution in 1917, and thus the name Leninism. Yet to be successful, you have to change the terms. As I've already suggested, the religion of Master Darwin and Master Marx was not playing out quickly enough, or perfectly enough for the Padawan disciples. So Lenin believed that the followers of vintage Marx placed way too much emphasis on the working class. They gave him too much credit. Lenin was convinced that the average farmer or dock worker was just too ignorant and downtrodden to take the initiative that would bring about this communist utopia. The solution? Professional agitators would be required to lead the workers to overthrow the ruling class and the Tsar. Future revolutions, Lenin said, would require a professional vanguard of militant fighters led by people like him to instigate class consciousness in society and actually overthrow the ruling class on behalf of the working class. So the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia, 1917, that gave birth to the atheistic and oppressive rule in the Soviet Union for over 70 years began not by natural development of society, not by the initiation of poor farmers who had enough, but with the deliberate jumpstart by an armed radical, a man who grew up in a wealthy middle-class family who were all well-educated, and Lenin even got to take law school classes. Now, the vintage Marxists would argue that what Lenin did is no longer social Darwinism, and they would be right. Because remember, it didn't happen naturally, it didn't happen in a capitalist economy, Russia was not, and it was not led by the common worker trying to get what was owed to him. But Lenin was a Marxist, And he would argue back that he and his peers were just taking Marx to a better and purer form of what their prophet had written so long ago. Social Darwinism, natural selection, didn't work. But social engineering, or Marxo-Darwinism, that works quite well. Now, I gave you my definition of elitism earlier. Here's what Webster has to say. Somebody who is an elite is somebody in the socially superior part of society. And elitism is a belief that a person, and you could consider yourself a person even if you're not, to be part of a socially elite group. So whether the actual elitist knows it or not, his position comes from a Marxist, Darwinistic worldview where certain segments of the population are really believed to be more worthy, more valuable, and more evolved than the rest of us Neanderthals. Lenin actually came from the societal class that was supposed to be eliminated when the common man took control of the earth and makes things right. Lenin was successful, however, in using that common man to rally to his cause against what Lenin considered the elites of his day, overthrowing the Russian Tsar and killing his family. And yet Lenin turned on those same farmers and factory workers and set up a government system that ultimately eliminated millions from the population of common working class. So who's the true elitist here? And whether or not Vladimir Lenin recognized his inherent hypocrisy, I can't say. But with Lenin came another shift in socialist doctrine and how to bring about great changes in society. You didn't have to be a member of the poor and working class to represent the oppressed segment of the population. Now, this is not empathy. This is something much more dark and much more manipulative. So it's at this point in history where psychology begins to merge with Darwin and Marx. And here's a paraphrase of what Lenin and other apologists began to believe. Consciousness raising implies that the place the revolution really occurs is in the human mind. Remember Gnosticism? Consciousness, not circumstance, determines if you're a true revolutionary. An intellectual who has his consciousness raised can count himself as one of the proletariat or the regular people. Let me translate. In other words, even if you, yourself, were not one of the victims pushed down by the ruling class, you could still consider yourself a brother or sister with one of those victims by raising your awareness, your consciousness of their situation, and agreeing that the victims need a champion. So here's the good news of the Gospel of Marx. You can transcend your boundaries. You don't have to be part of the enemy's camp, those bourgeois, head honchos. You can be the champion for the little guy. You can evolve past class boundaries by getting on board with what the organizers are telling you, that this group or that group is being treated unfairly. So you could redefine who you are, not by actually changing your life situation or by giving up the stuff you have, but by aligning yourself with the newest preacher of Marxism. And if you do belong to the class who are really needing help from the self-appointed saviors, there's good news for you too. You will not be alone to carry out the revolution that we decided you needed to create. From Lenin's point of view, the proletarian or the common man's revolution did not need to be carried out by the common man. It could be done for them. So you could be an artist, an intellectual, a university dean, even a member of the upper class with gobs of money. The group, remember, that was supposed to be removed by Lenin and his cronies? As long as you now realize that you're on the right side of the conflict and take your place next to those labeled as victims. Is this starting to sound hauntingly contemporary? Please do not misunderstand. What we're talking about here in this whole thing between rich and poor in Marxism is not a reflection of historic or current Marxism as the attempt to apply the biblical command to look after the widows, orphans, and the poor. Throughout the places where socialism has been implemented, it is the poor, the widows, and the orphans who are most often harmed beyond anybody else. And God's word has plenty to say against the rich who keep their riches in order to deliberately bring injustice to the poor. That's not what we're talking about. That's just the excuse to create what they tried to create. You see, neither Marx nor Lenin nor Darwin were believers with an accurate and scriptural picture of poverty and wealth when they wrote their ideologies down. They created and recreated their own philosophy or borrowed one from some more wicked origin and used it to accomplish their own objectives. So how does a man of education like Lenin, and means like Lenin, become a champion for the common man when he himself was not one of the underclass that needed rescuing? You just change the terms. The actual elitists will claim that they're not trying to determine how things should be for everybody else's life. They're just here to help you improve your place in life by following what they say is best for you. At the same time, they will call a regular person an elitist for having his own opinion. An opinion that you don't particularly want to force on others. You just want to be able to live by a different worldview in peace. While on the surface, the socialist ideology appears to be a battle between rich and poor, which it is in the original writings of Marx, it has evolved by deliberate rewriting from one disciple to the next and one generation to the next. So you have to follow the threads as you see. But whatever definitions you may find concerning socialism now, or communism, or Marxist-Darwinism, you need to understand this. The whole of the social Marxist worldview requires a battle between different classes or groups of people. Those less informed about the roots of socialism really might believe that taking from one person and giving it to another lines up with God's idea of caring for the less fortunate, but they would be wrong. And while counting yourself as one in the group that needs help may come from honest empathy on the part of the person who is rallying to that group's cause, there are any one of several deceptions that are often woven into place that you need to be aware of before you jump on and start raising money for that organization. So be on guard and be careful of the terms you're hearing. Here's some of those deceptions. The division between groups comes from a false designation of division. In other words, the conflict is often manufactured. Another one is that the division is real, but you're told there is none, so you compromise where you should not. The terms are the same, but they're not using it as you understand it, and so you come to an unfortunate conclusion about the matter. Or the cause has a very valid basis, but it's being manipulated by those who have a very different agenda than what you walked on with. If you dig just below the surface, the groups now labeled as bad or good, oppressors or obstructionists, left or right, are usually being defined by one group: elitists. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. We've only scratched the surface concerning the roots of our current political context. But hold on, we'll pick this up again next week and give you some more. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us an anchor that does not change in your word, that gives us a place to go to all the time when we're not sure what is taking place around us or what is being meant by something communicated, or when a world event seems to rock our foundation for a moment. Thank you that your word is unchanging, that you are unchanging, that you are the one that we depend on to gain some clarity as we try to ferret our way through or navigate the jungle of this family tree. And I pray that you would bring to awareness those in our highest levels of leadership, the deceptions that they have taken for granted, that the causes that they're supporting may have darker roots or may have excellent roots. Give them a desire to be discerning and to dig a little bit deeper and to be researchers in the process and not just jump on as soon as somebody says something in the media and they're the next one to say so. I pray for our local leaders and for our government officials as we're coming and switching into a new governorship now, that you would give them a desire to dig deeper to look for justice and for righteousness the way you define it, so that they would pursue those things in the offices that you've handed to them. And I pray that you would thwart and undermine the efforts of those who know very well what they're doing and has nothing to do with you, so that they would not be successful in bringing more damage and causing more harm and allowing those who are less fortunate to suffer even greater than they have. You're an amazing God. And we thank you for giving us a place where we can come and be reminded of the fact that you're still in charge, that you still have a much bigger plan ahead, and that regardless of the chaos and craziness that we encounter, and sometimes even this Twilight Zone experience, it's not the end of the story. So we look forward to the return of your Son, and we cry out that you would bring that about soon. Give us wisdom as we walk through this week until we gather together again in Jesus' name. Amen.